Hello. I'm swimming in my parents' pool in California. And I'm reading some California themed books, which I'm going to talk about in this very sunny reading vlog. Good morning. I am not in California anymore. I am back in Washington. So I didn't talk a lick about books while I was there because it was the busiest whirlwind of a trip, in and out. I ate a lot of In-N-Out, so that. So the books I read. So first I read Battleborn by Claire V. Watkins, which is a book of short stories by her. I believe now I've read her whole canon. I guess you could say I discovered Claire V. Watkins last year, and she quickly has become one of my favorite writers. This was such a good short story collection. I gave it a 5 out of 5. I love her writing. The way she writes about the West is absolutely incredible. And though I was in California, many of these stories are set in Nevada, specifically Reno, Las Vegas, but there definitely was a lot in California. The last story was my favorite, set in San Francisco. Just absolutely all around beautiful, top-notch writing. Highly, highly recommend Battleborn and really anything by Claire V. Watkins if you haven't read anything by her. And I am filming all this as I walk my dog, as I walk to a coffee shop, trying to get some work done. Because I've been super busy. Haven't had time to really sit down and chat with y'all. That's the dog pulling move. And then I read Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion. So another book of essays. And holy cow, also incredible, blowing my mind. I'm not done with it. I'm about halfway through, and she really captures the essence of California and its culture in the 60s and 70s. And so Slouching Towards Bethlehem is a book that essentially is all of her writings that she published separately in the 60s and 70s, so in magazines, some stuff from Vogue, things like that, that she then compiled them into a essay collection. And the title, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, I believe comes from the Yeats poem, with the beginning talking about the center will not hold, which she talks about a lot in her namesake essay, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, which is about the hippie movement in San Francisco in the late 60s. So, holy cow, it's a great book of essays, highly recommend it. The only Joan Didion I've read is The Year of Magical Thinking, and that was a long time ago, probably 5 years ago. So really excited to be digging into some of her other works, and would like to keep doing that because she's a very, very good writer. So that is what I read this weekend while I was in California. I will hop back on here and talk to you more a little later about some other of my favorite books set in California that I have read in my lifetime and that I recommend. Okay, talk to you soon.
Several days later.
So good morning, everybody. I know last week I did a little bit of filming when I got back from California and said I would shortly talk to you about some other books about California that I love. I have been so busy. It is now basically a week later since I filmed that. I've been gone 3 weekends in a row. I was in Portland last weekend visiting some friends. So I have just been a little bit all over the place. So I thought I would finally catch up and film that now. Okay. So just to recap, when I was in California, I read 2 books, and it was Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion and Battleborn by Claire Bay Watkins. And they both are books that touch on different themes in California and the West. I thought that I would give some just suggestions of books that I have read set in California or that are really about California. And obviously there's so many out there, but these are the ones that I've read and have stuck out to me. So I'm gonna get started with a couple classics, which everyone's gonna be like, yeah, duh. But I really have to promote East of Eden by John Steinbeck. This book is probably okay, so let's back up. I grew up in San Luis Obispo County in California. I don't know if people know where that is. It is about 3 hours south of San Francisco, 3 hours north of LA. So north of Santa Barbara, south of Big Sur. So really just between these big behemoths of places that are always written about, very much well known in the culture, but this little spot I grew up in was rural, coastal, and just very unique. And John Steinbeck is probably our closest writer who really talks about this region, and he writes very specifically about Monterey and the Salinas Valley. And just the way that this book opens up, he says, the Salinas Valley is in Northern California. It is a long, narrow swale between 2 ranges of mountains, and the Salinas River winds and twists up the center until it falls at last into Monterey Bay. And, I grew up running around the mostly dry bed of the Salinas River as a kid. It's basically just the first chapter in this book describes the landscape of where I grew up in this gorgeous way, where he's talking about the wildflowers and the different seasons and how in the spring everything's so lush and then how dry it gets in the summer. And this is just like an epic tale. And I think John Steinbeck writes about California in such a beautiful, incredible way. And if you really want to get that essence, I highly suggest East of Eden. And then of course I have to promote The Grapes of Wrath, also by John Steinbeck. And this book starts out in Oklahoma, and it's about a family of who have been impacted by the Dust Bowl and have had their land taken from them, and they load up everything they own and make the arduous journey to California. And when they get there, basically realize that they're in for a huge fight and a very, very tough life of trying to work the fields and live off the land, when in the past when their land has been taken from them. And this is also just a great metaphor for capitalism. John Steinbeck really doesn't hold back in his critiques. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book. One of my favorite books of all time. Both of these are two of my favorite books of all time. So I have to promote them. This is just, I think, some of the most beautiful written stuff about California. Particularly Grapes of Wrath, this idea of coming to California to start anew and to, you know, live your dreams. And they talk so much as they're like moving across the West to get to California, and how they're going to find, you know, basically what they need to survive, and it's going to be comfortable and the weather's going to be good and they're going to have all these crops. And when they get there, you know, it's like not that at all. And I think that like that's California. It really chews you up and spits you out in a lot of ways, but it's also the most beautiful place in the world, I think. So yes, Grapes of Wrath. And then on that note of books that are about finding fortune and goodness in California, it's a book I read earlier this year, and that is How Much of These Hills is Gold. And this is a historical fiction book that came out a couple years ago, and it follows a Chinese American family as they are trying to make it in the California gold rush. And it really follows the relationship between the two siblings who their parents came from China and they were born in California, and how this is the only place they've ever known, but they're told that they're outsiders. This isn't a spoiler, but their parents die, and basically they're left alone to fend for themselves and either try and find gold or try and survive, try to get to San Francisco. That's really what the book is about. It's beautifully written, absolutely gorgeous. You know, talks about the gold rush in such a interesting way. You know, as a kid, how I was taught it in school was just such bullshit, you know what I mean? Like, I didn't actually get taught any of the context of it. And you know, it was a really, really awful thing for a lot of people that, you know, especially the Chinese population in California, and how they passed legislation very quickly to make it so even if Chinese people did find gold, they couldn't keep it. They weren't allowed to basically amass any wealth. There was so much racism and white supremacy. Yeah, so this book, I think, is just such a raw and gritty way of dealing with the gold rush. It's just very much like you're out on the land and it's not pretty. But it was just such a beautiful book. And then also I do have to say there's a really good short story in Battleborn about the gold rush that really reminded me of How Much of These Hills is Gold. Okay, so two other recommendations. These books are more set in cities, and are sort of more contemporary. So the first is There There by Tommy Orange, and There is a novel that follows basically, I guess I would say, I don't know how many different characters, but a different cast of characters of Native Americans who live in Oakland, California. Some of them have come from Oklahoma or are coming to Oakland from Oklahoma, and really talks about how there is this urban community of indigenous people who have been displaced from their land and basically were pushed into cities. And I really love all the different stories and how they intertwine. I also, in this book, Tommy Orange has a chapter where he talks about how Native Americans took over Alcatraz in the 70s as an occupation to basically try and claim the land as their own. And it was just really well written. I learned a lot in reading that book, and yeah, I highly recommend Tommy Orange as a very important California writer, a very important voice in contemporary California fiction. Okay, so the next book is America Is Not the Heart. So I read this book back in, 2020, I think. Maybe 2021. No, it was 2020. And it was one of my favorite books of the year. This is kind of a multi-generational family saga that follows a Filipino family in the San Jose area in California, but it does go back and forth between the Philippines and San Jose, but really talks about how the Filipino community really takes care of each other in San Jose. That was one of the things that I thought was so beautiful in this book, was just the community of people. Yeah, and I just think that this book talks about the Bay Area in a really unique and interesting way, and I just thought it was one of the most beautiful books I've read in a while. It was one of my favorite books of 2020, so highly recommend America Is Not the Heart. Okay, so another book I'd love to recommend is The Girls by Emma Cline, and I did read this recently, I think back in March or April. And this is, I guess, a historical fiction, you could say. And Emma Cline is following a young girl who's about 14 who lives in Northern California. I want to say like the Sonoma area, Napa area perhaps, and falls in with a Charles Manson-like cult. And it was a beautiful way of, I think, describing girlhood. And the power and dangers of girlhood, and also a really good snapshot of California in the 60s. I think a great companion to Joan Didion's writing in that sense. I'm sure Emma Cline took a lot of inspiration from that, because there's a lot of sort of, I know that Joan Didion writes a lot about, or has written about, the Manson murders, and that's very much what The Girls is centered around, and captures California in this very unique way, particularly at that current time, very formative time in the 1960s. Okay, and another historical fiction I would love to recommend, which is actually a young adult book, but I had such a good time reading it. I read it when I was in 4th grade, as most California 4th graders were assigned to read, but it is The Island of the Blue Dolphins. So I reread this back in February, because in February I got to go to the Channel Islands for the first time. I can't believe I hadn't been my whole life. I grew up just a couple hours from them, and went sea kayaking with my family, and it was very, very amazing. And I remembered the very visceral memories I had of reading Island of the Blue Dolphins as a kid, and thinking it was so cool because I could see the islands. I had seen them from the shore before, and reading about, well, I guess I should tell you what the book's about. So it is about a young Chumash woman who gets left behind on one of the islands by herself, while the rest of her tribe was taken to the mainland by white settlers. And there's a lot of reasons why the tribe was taken to the mainland, and there's a lot of issues with what's historical, what's not, and also, like, were they forced to be taken to the mainland? Did they choose? There was a lot of factors happening in that area of California at the time. You had the Jesuit missionaries that showed up, but then you also had Russian fur traders that were being very aggressive to kind of the coastal indigenous communities in California. And that was something that was happening to these people on this island. And so they decided to go to the mainland to not risk the violence that they had experienced from the Russian fur traders. But this young woman decided to stay behind. And there is not a ton of historical evidence as to why she decided to stay behind, but she did. And it's basically her journey of survival on the island, and it is beautifully written, covers the landscape in such a gorgeous way. The way she has to, like, hunt for abalone, makes friends with an otter, makes friends with a wolf. Like, it's the stuff, like, of course, as a kid I loved those kinds of books as a kid, and I loved rereading it. It was such joy. So highly recommend Island of the Blue Dolphins if you want a YA historical fiction book. It was written a long time ago. And I have to say, for it being written a long time ago, it was very respectful and very well researched, and it was not problematic, really. It was a very well done book. Okay, so now I'm going to move into nonfiction. Of course, Didion was, nonfiction, but there's a few books that I think you wouldn't think would be about California, but they really are. So the first book I want to recommend is How to Do Nothing. So this book came out maybe 2019, maybe 2018, I don't remember. And I feel like I've seen a lot of mixed reviews. A lot of people don't like it, but I really, really loved it. It was super formative for me because I was in my graduate studies when this book came out, and particularly studying attention and the information economy. And so this book was kind of one of those books that I read and I was like, yes, this is everything I have been thinking, and someone wrote it. Thank you. And she talks a lot about California in this book because her big thesis statement as the antidote to the attention economy and kind of tech companies always trying to grab your attention is to basically get to know the world around you, get to know the ecosystem in which you live, and shift your attention to something else. And with her, that was bird watching and trying to understand the native flora and fauna of where she lives in Oakland, California. So that is talked about a ton in this book, and was just a great way to kind of also get that understanding of the culture and the culture of also like Silicon Valley. I think she talks about that a lot, and it's like very much parallel to the idea of the gold rush, right? And yeah, I thought that was a great little nonfiction book that you wouldn't think is about California, but I think at the heart of it, it is. The other nonfiction I want to recommend is Rebecca Solnit's Recollections of My Non-Existence. This was her memoir that came out also, I think, last year. It's one of my favorite books I read last year, and this is her talking about her childhood in California and her young adulthood in San Francisco, and writes about San Francisco in the 70s and 80s, which I really love to read about because it's a great contrast to Didion's writing of San Francisco in the 60s, because so much had changed by the 70s and 80s, and there was a lot, it wasn't as like, the vibes were different. Let's just leave it at that. As we know with the hippie movement, you know, the theory that once the Manson murders happened, it was kind of over. And, you know, things changed a lot in the 70s and 80s. She talks about the beginnings of the punk movement in San Francisco. It was just really well written, a beautiful, beautiful memoir, also about being a woman and rejecting forms of patriarchy. I just thought it was absolutely gorgeous. So, yeah, it just has a lot of beautiful writings about San Francisco and that time, and about the beat poets. She has great critiques of the beat poets. I'm not a big fan. You're seeing here that I'm like not really bringing them up as recommendations for California, and that's because I think there's other things out there that are better. But if you're gonna read a beat, it should be Gary Snyder, and that's it. You don't need to read anybody else. Okay, so last nonfiction, and this is, I'm obsessed with this book. It's really big. It's kind of like a picture book, but it's so cool. And it is called State of Change, Forgotten Landscapes to California. And this book is written by a incredible artist and scientist, Laura Cunningham. And basically she did a ton of research to try and depict what California was like before colonialism. And she talks a lot about how the habitat has changed with industrialization and colonialism. Let me try and find some of the most like big pictures here. But a big thing she talks about is how there used to be just so much wildlife in California. And this is sort of like her depiction of San Francisco Bay. Let's see if I can show you all. So she has these illustrations that she's done herself of what she, with her research, thinks what San Francisco Bay looked like before industrialization, how many animals were there. And also one thing I love, you know, there's the bear on the front, and a lot of that is because there were so many grizzly bears in California. And so she says hundreds of years ago on a bay mudflat, you have bears, grizzly bears basically, eating a whale because they used to live off of sea life, but there aren't really any bears on the coast really anymore. There are some, I shouldn't say really, in Northern California. I'm sure there are, but not like there used to be. So this was just such a cool book to read. I read it on a road trip many years ago when I was going through California, and I just thought it was the coolest thing ever written. She talks about California condors, which are also really sick, which are very endangered, but they're some of the biggest birds in the world. It's just really cool. She talks about salmon and the dying salmon population in California. There used to be so much salmon, and now there's basically very little. Yeah, so it's just a really cool book. I bought it at the Henry Miller Library in Big Sur when I was driving through there, when I was on that road trip, and I'm just so grateful I did. I had the best time reading this book, and I highly recommend it. It's so cool. Yeah, I saved my favorite for last, so I just love this book. Yeah, and then one other thing I will say, haven't read it. I got my first advanced reader's copy of something, and it is from Little Brown, so thank you, Little Brown, and it's The High Sierra, A Love Story by Kim Stanley Robinson. So some of you may know, but I am hiking the John Muir Trail this summer, which is a little over 200-mile hiking trail in the Sierra Mountains in California. And so I saw that Kim Stanley Robinson, who is a sci-fi writer, was coming out with sort of an ode to the Sierras. And I was like, I gotta read this. And Little Brown was so kind to send me a copy, so thank you. Haven't read it yet, but I'm excited to read more about the Sierras. It's cute. It looks like he spent a lot of time there hiking his whole life, and it looks like it covers the history of it and whatnot. So I'll let you all know as I read it. But yeah, I think too, I didn't bring up any John Muir because I don't really want to promote his stuff. He was a very racist, white supremacist dude and did a lot of harm to indigenous populations in California, so I do not want to suggest his work, but I was excited to see somebody else writing about the High Sierra. So I will read this and report back, I guess. But yeah, those were my books on California. It's one of, I have a lot of weird feelings about it because I've lived up in the Pacific Northwest now for about 10 years. And I always think that I want to go back to California, but there is this grief, this kind of climate change grief where I feel like I can't move back. And then there's also the economic grief of it being a place that is really inaccessible to a lot of people. It's very expensive. I also live in an expensive place. Seattle is not accessible either, but there's just where I grew up has really become not an affordable place to live. And I think a lot of people have felt this as millennials, is, oh, my home, I can't live in my own home anymore because I can't afford it. I think there's a very particular grief with that. I've talked to a lot of people from Seattle who grew up here and are priced out, and they're like, but this is my home. How can I be priced out of my home? And I think there's a lot of economic grief and then the added climate grief of drought and lack of water and things like that. So I'm still in the Pacific Northwest. We'll probably be in the Pacific Northwest for a long time, but the power and beauty of books is that they bring us to places that maybe we can't physically be in. So yeah, that's sort of my musings on California. It was beautiful to be able to go there. It's magic every time. There's something about that place, and it is magic. That's the only way to describe it. All right, I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for listening, and yeah, we'll talk soon. Bye, Rosie.